Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Indian Genes. We have a very special guest today, and I think the introduction itself is going to make all of you want to sit back and listen to this amazing story and what this person has been doing. The field that she is involved is death literature, and she has been involved with research in behavior design for over 10 years. She also has started the first of its kind, a foundation called MAAJHI in India, which is into its 11th year now. And she was introduced to this particular field or this particular aspect through the experiences that she's been through. And I think we'll get into that as well. She has presented her work on global platforms and has authored a chapter on well-being in death and dying in the Handbook of Happiness, commissioned by the Happiness Monk of Bhutan. So, before me having to spend time telling you all her stories and speaking about her, I think the best thing to do is bring her on. And here we have to all our Indian Genes listeners a very special person, Krittika Sharma. So, Kritika, from everyone in Indian Genes, a very, very warm welcome to you. It's amazing that we're getting a chance to speak because I remember the first time I read about you, this was online. And the first thing that struck me was, wow, this is such a brave person because what you were talking about, and for everybody listening, which is death literature, is something we've been living with or we live with all our lives. And we sometimes tend to put that in some corner in our mind and say we'll deal with it when we have to deal with it. So I was really amazed when I read about what you were doing and especially MAAJHI. But for all our listeners, Kritika, once again, welcome. Thank you for taking time to speak to us. And I know it's about 11 o'clock where you are, right?
Yes.
So it's not a very early morning, but let me hand over to you. And for people listening to you or getting to know you for the first time, Kritika, how would you want to introduce yourself on what you do, why you got to doing what you're doing, and I'll leave that to you.
Sure. Thank you, Joachim, for having me. And I'm really honored to be on your podcast. I've just heard such wonderful things about you, and just very glad to talk to you today. So I've had 15 years of experience in the space of behavior design and research, and it's been really in multiple fields in healthcare and technology, in financial services, in the development sector. And for MAAJHI, this is all sort of fed into MAAJHI. MAAJHI is a 10-year, maybe going on to its 11th year, labor of love, really focusing on death literacy. And what we really do is focus on experiences and tools to humanize loss, grief, aging, and finding meaning.
So when I look at this, I'm just wondering whether I don't think anyone is doing this in India, and MAAJHI as an organization, as a startup, is probably the only one who's dealing with this kind of language, if I could call it, and then psychological language, obviously.
So MAAJHI is the first of its kind in India in terms of the multidisciplinariness of it. But of course, there are so many wonderful people in India doing the work in the space of end of life care and palliative care, in the space of aging, in the space of grief. But I think with MAAJHI, what we're really trying to do is to bring in the more human aspects of death and dying, of aging, of grief, because all of these are human experiences. And like you rightly said in the introduction, death is a certainty where it's almost like 100% guarantee that we're all going to go there at some point in our lives. But it's really about, we tend to not talk about it. We tend to be fairly worried about what's going to happen, and I think that this is one of the reasons why we avoid it. And I think death is for me, death has been, or looking and understanding more about death and dying has enabled me to think about my life more intentionally. And I think that is really the message of MAAJHI, that by thinking about death and dying, or thinking about the end of life, we it allows us to anchor into a space of thinking about how we live our lives.
Right. And if we look at this particular aspect of field that you are in, I remember there was a book. I think it was called The Meaning of Death, and I can't really remember. Probably a gentleman by the name of Herman Feifel, if I'm getting that right, that probably started this in the 20th century. Formally, we will go back to where the other origins are, but as a study in psychology, was that the beginning of it, or was his work or book important in bringing this to mainstream?
I think there are many people who brought it to the mainstream. I think there have been a lot of interesting people, like, for example, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who really brought, helped us understand the stages of grief, for example, and that's something that is used widely with the medical community. It's used with patients. It's used across the world. We also have religion that allows us to think about death and or end of life, or what happens in the afterlife. So there are many people who have spoken about death and dying. We have philosophers like J. Krishnamurti who've also spoken about death, and that also in its own way being a mindful practice. So I don't think that there's one starting point per se. I think that different cultures and different communities have brought death into our language and into our everyday in their own ways. And death used to be a fairly community led practice. And over time, we've had medical communities also sort of come into it because of how we look at science and looking at the progress of science and technology. We've brought it into hospital spaces, we've brought it into medical spaces as well.
Right. And do you think over the last few years with COVID and the impact that COVID had all over the world, like we said, that we've always been dealing with that in our own way. We probably did not have a structure or the ability to talk about how we or understand how we go through grief. But did COVID was that a turning point where people realized that this was something we've not been talking about, and now because of the volume and because of what's happened, it came to the forefront? Because whether we like it or not, each and every one was dealing with this particular aspect on a daily basis altogether, and somehow there was this community grief that people had to deal with, whether it was somebody from your family, somebody you knew. It just got all very difficult. So did that particular phase of when COVID happened and with all the results, did you see any change globally and in India as to people now being a little bit more receptive or saying that, okay, this is probably at our doorstep, we need to deal with it?
Absolutely. I actually think that this was a huge moment of collective grief for all of us. And it wasn't, it was everyone from medical communities, from, to individuals, as you mentioned. It impacted everybody at a global scale. And so suddenly death was on the map. Suddenly everyone was talking about grief. Suddenly everyone wanted to know what they could do about it because the context was right here. And as you rightly said, either you were dealing with it in your own family or you knew someone who was dealing with it. And of course, the anticipation of it, there was anticipatory grief of what might happen should COVID continue the way it was. So I think that a lot of people became more aware and wanted to understand how to deal with it, wanted to understand how they could support others. And I think that one interesting thing that I've always stood by is that we all understand the language of loss. If we go out of the language of grief and death for a minute, I think if we look at it from a larger sort of lens of looking at loss, we all understand loss. And loss is not always about death. It could be a loss of a relationship. It could be a loss of a job. As you know, as a kid, you might have lost your favorite toy. We all understand loss. And I think that what MAAJHI tries to do, or what I have been focusing on, is offering and creating spaces where people are able to tap into a language that they know but they don't speak as frequently with. So I think it was an interesting time for MAAJHI. It was an interesting time for the work that I'd been doing, because I at that time had already become sort of the former director of Death Over Dinner. So I think a lot of people already knew about some of the work that I was doing. And during COVID, that was the time where I opened up all the MAAJHI resources for free, because that was a moment where I wanted to ensure that whoever needed support and help could get it. Um, and I think that that was the time where I saw a lot of people wanting education, wanting support, wanting a sense of being seen, and also wanting to be seen without a sense of judgment.
Right. And you just mentioned death over dinner. Could you tell us a little more about that? What exactly was that?
Sure. So, Death Over Dinner is an initiative that was started by Michael Hebb and Angel Grant in the U.S. Probably about in 2013, I think. And the whole idea was, it's literally in the tagline. It's death over dinner, and the idea is that, we've taken death into spaces like hospitals. We talk about death, when we write a will to a lawyer. It's really removed from us, or it's possibly addressed only when something happens. But the idea of bringing death to a table, we're so used to sitting around our families or our friends, or with our loved ones. We love sitting, like eating is a community sort of thing. So bringing it into a space like that, where you can break bread with people, and just sit around in a comfortable, non-threatening environment, and talking about it, is really where the idea came from. That you're really trying to bring it back into community. You're really trying to make it more available. And so Death Over Dinner had multiple sort of prompts that one could use on the dinner table. And I designed everything that was required for the Indian audience. I also facilitated death over dinners across 7 to 8 states in India. I think we had about 300 or 350 people that I facilitated with in 6 months, just speaking about different aspects of death and dying. And it was a wonderful experience, because I think, like I said before, I think a lot of people feel like they don't have the language. I actually think that everyone has the language. It calls upon a sense of vulnerability, a sense of reflection, self awareness, just all the good human things that we need to connect with each other. And every table was unique, because you have different people, so you have different perspectives, you have different kinds of losses that people have gone through. You might have people sitting on the table who have not gone through a really big loss, and therefore are wondering how to deal with it when it happens. They're sitting right next to someone who probably has gone through many losses. So it was a very dynamic experience to offer this, almost like a gift, or almost like an invitation for people to come and feel safe, feel seen, and feel heard in these dinners.
Right. And I think the number, what you managed to do, or collectively what you all managed to do, was nearly over 200,000. That's staggering. Because when you look at an event like this, the starting point itself is to get people in to open themselves up to this kind of dialogue. And post this death over dinner, does the community then in some way keep in touch with each other? Is there a support mechanism? People are probably, most, I assume, at the first meeting would just be listening and absorbing, right? And take time to actually start speaking out. So is there some kind of a community follow up, or you guide them to where they have to go?
So, Death Over Dinner globally has 200,000 dinners. The ones that we did in India were, of course, the ones that I facilitated. But after that, a lot of people reached out to me saying, how do we take this forward? And that's where we had created all the resources, and we put it up for free, so that, I didn't need to necessarily be there to facilitate it, but they had all the material that was required to do their own dinners. So I think we're accounting for the dinners that possibly that we know about. It wasn't, and I'm sure there have been more dinners in that aspect. The dinners that we had, because I was there to facilitate it, everyone who was at the table was participating, not necessarily only listening in. And I actually think that it's 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 been such a wonderful eye opener for me in terms of how open people are. They, if you create an environment for people to be there in a respectful way, in a kind way, in a way that really allows them to be witnessed. And I think so much of grief or loss needs to be witnessed. That's really there's no solution for grief. I'm definitely in a space where, in design thinking, I'm sort of just switching a little bit to my behavior design brain for a minute. I think, we always say that there's a problem statement, then you do enough research to understand how to reframe it, and then you go into a solution space. This is a unique space that has no solution. So you're not trying to solve, you're trying to understand what else to do with it. You're trying to understand how to support, you're trying to understand how to witness. And you're, in some ways, you're also giving permission to people to just be. And I don't think we allow for that a lot. I think in the way we live, I think we want to expedite all these emotions, these feelings, these experiences. We want people to get back to normal and get back to business. um, Grief and loss, it changes us fundamentally. And so I think that through Death Over Dinner, um, and after that, as I moved on and I moved forward, one of the things that I did was I created a framework for well-being, which was really looking at three aspects that you have. What are you in service of? What functions does it really do? And one of the things that I actually put out there was looking at aesthetics, not in terms of how good something looks in a surface level way, but really focusing on aesthetic intelligence. This was a phrase that I was very inspired by somebody called Pauline Brown, who really talks about aesthetics as a form of mindfulness, intention, and intelligence. And I think that, if you walk into a space that looks inviting, if you walk on to a dinner table, for example, that looks um, warm, that looks non-threatening, you're going to feel comfortable. And I think that that's something that I've really taken forward with MAAJHI as well. We've taken a lot of time with the content. We've taken a lot of time with even putting the design of MAAJHI together. I worked with a wonderful uh, designer called Moksha, who really brought all these elements together so beautifully. Because every time somebody tells me that they feel comfortable approaching MAAJHI, I think that she has a lot to do with it. I think she has a lot to do with bringing that sensibility into the space.
Right. And what I also like with what you do, and I've been reading a lot uh, on what you've been putting out there, is you're kind of putting a framework around grief and loss. Because this is the way I think, but I don't know if you think the same way. Because if there is no framework, and as long as there is no framework, then there's a lot of ambiguity, and then you let in too many beliefs, you could let in too many dogmas, and that's where the space gets totally infiltrated with probably thoughts, intentions that may be good or not so good, and it becomes a bit complicated. But like you were mentioning, you just mentioned about, opposed to you saying about the death over dinner, you spoke about the framework for grief, you spoke about a framework for loss, and I think that really helps and is the right direction. Coming to what you mentioned about MAAJHI, that's really interesting on its own. But before we get into MAAJHI, I just wanted to know, that's a very interesting name. And symbolically, does it mean something? Is it telling us something? Is there a message there?
MAAJHI, my father named MAAJHI. He came up with the name, and he's really wonderful at bringing these magical moments together. MAAJHI in Sanskrit means ferryman, and in many cultures we believe that there's a ferryman that takes the soul across. And I think that, I'm getting goosebumps as I'm saying this, but I think that that just felt so right in terms of what MAAJHI wants to be for and hopes to be. MAAJHI really wants to be in service of allowing people and empowering people to navigate grief, loss, humanize it, really bring the sentiment of what it means to be human through it. So I think that it ties in really well. And as I mentioned, Moksha has done a beautiful job of the aesthetic intelligence of you know of what you see on the website and what you see of the offerings.
That's a stunning name. I think symbolically as well. The first time I read it, I wasn't sure, but I did. It did strike me straight away because you were talking about ancient mythologies or beliefs, and I think one of the popular ones in India. Yes, we do know about the Magi, and probably I think an ancient goddess as well in the older days was referred to as Magi, and but it was probably people would have recognized it in Egyptian mythology because if you hear the story about Osiris and Isis, for example, with the big boats, and just next to the pyramids, they found all these boats that have been buried, thousands of them, in fact, and their mythology said the same thing that that particular boat carries your soul across the Milky Way, but we leave that because it's just a brilliant name. So now coming back to Maji, and if you could tell us structurally, you mentioned about losses, and we will get to that as well. However, for a person to start thinking about the end, there doesn't necessarily have to be a time when, past this particular age, you start preparing. I'm just talking about individually, and then we can come to grievance or loss of a friend or family member. But individually, at any age or any time, that if we do push that back somewhere, it could come out in different behaviors because up to a particular age it's still there but you don't want to talk about it. What is your thought on this? Is it bad, is it good that we educate people at a particular age earlier to start dealing with this and not push it to too late?
And it's such a great question. I don't think that there's an age where you start to learn about it, but from a developmental space, I think children tend to get curious probably, between the age of 7 and 11. That's probably the time where they are seeing or they do get to witness some kind of loss, um, or they hear about it in some way. And I think children have this wonderful ability to and clarity. They ask questions, they're curious, and I think that that is a great time to open up conversations. What I've noticed is, and we've done a lot of research around this, we are looking to publish a children's book on looking at loss as well. What we realized is that many adults who have interacted with MAAJHI, their understanding of death and dying or of loss um, comes from their childhood or from their first memory of loss. And many times we've heard people say things like, when this death happened, nobody spoke to me, or, I wasn't allowed to go to the funeral, or when I asked questions, I was shut down. There's this sense of feeling like life is good, death is bad. And so you because we don't answer some of these questions in a way that is healthy, we end up doing a great disservice to how we then move forward with our understanding of it. If you're told that it's something you don't talk about, then you think that there's something wrong with it, when in fact, we're all going there. And so I think that it's so important for us to, I never say that there's an age limit, but obviously if I am talking to a child or if I'm talking to somebody younger, I would like to have, um, you know, uh, their loved one, somebody who's an adult who can be there so that there is care and support for everyone involved. Um, I do, it makes me think of places like Bhutan. When you go to their temples, they will have the gods or goddesses who sit there. So you might have the goddess of compassion, and you will have Yamraj, who's the god of death, right next to, just sitting side by side. And I think that Bhutan is a great example of how they really value seeing both life and death. And I think that for me, I personally feel like that honestly makes them a healthier society because they're able to talk about the things that we sometimes don't want to talk about. And I think that death can happen at any time. It's unfortunately random. We don't know when it happens, and so being prepared for it at any age, any stage in life is important. However, I can completely understand and empathize with the fact that we tend to it when something happens in our lives, like maybe a loved one falls sick, or we fall sick, or we're talking about a will. There are conversations that happen at these particular moments. Also, from a behavioral perspective, we tend to see our future selves as a stranger. So if I walked past my future self, 20 years from now, if I walk past that person, I probably won't recognize them because we don't have an understanding of what's going to happen to us going forward, but we have past memory. So we tend to understand our patterns of the past and not of the future, which is why it is very important to start talking to people about what their end of life care, what end of life looks like for them, what death looks like, what is grief going to look like, what happens if they lose someone. And these conversations don't necessarily have to be upsetting, they don't have to be depressing. uh, they are difficult conversations for sure, but I think so much of talking about death, or at least how much I've done of it in the past 10, 11, 12 years now, has enabled me to think about my life more intentionally. And I think, that's really where MAAJHI is hoping to be of service. That talking about death is not necessarily bringing it on, it's actually empowering people to think about the way they want to live life, um, living by their values, how their purpose gets built into it, how they can really design their life.
Right. And when we talk about, you just spoke about Bhutan, you authored the, was it the Handbook of Happiness there, right? So is it looked at together when you talk about happiness? And then, yes, you can also talk about that, but it's looked at together. So you do not have to put anyone in a separate basket and then say you deal with it, but it's part of the whole, right?
Mhm. In fact, interestingly, when I was writing this, when I was, invited to write this chapter, I had a very big problem with the word happiness because the way we look at happiness is joy, and we look at it, it's devoid of anything that's sad in a way, right? If one wants to define it very loosely. And I remember when I was writing the article, I actually went back to speak to a few monks to say, I'm uncomfortable with this word because I don't want people to think that I'm writing this as a contradiction. I don't want people to be insulted by the word happiness. And because happiness is packaged in many ways that that may not be understanding of what I was writing. And I remember one of the monks was telling me that happiness, for in his understanding, was contentment, was well-being, was balance, was intentionality. And so the whole chapter was written based on that because that's when I kind of understood it. That's when I said, okay, I can reframe the word. um, and I think it's, to your point, I think when you go to spaces in Bhutan, you will not have people raising their eyebrows when you talk about death. It's part of life. It's a cycle. It's They honor it, they understand it, they live with it. And I think that we tend to separate it. We tend to say that this is life, this is death. And I oftentimes have to talk about how death is a moment, but everything that comes before it and after it is something that we all have to deal with. You mentioned people, during COVID, or, you know, with or without COVID, we've all gone through losses. Death is that one moment, but what you deal with before it, how you deal with it, your own death or somebody else's death, and how you grieve after it. I've also understood and realized through my work is that when you don't talk about death and when it comes, it can result in a lot of conflict. It can result in a lot of conversations that should have been had so long ago and they didn't. It can lead to not being present to the person that you love. You're not spending time with them the right way because you're probably scared to, or you're fighting, or everyone is sort of so tense that, or you don't know the other person's wishes, you don't want to talk about it, or you don't want to talk about how you're feeling. And so when that person passes away, it almost changes your grieving trajectory, because now you're wondering whether you did the right things. You might still be in conflict. Whereas we've noticed that people who do end up talking about it with their loved ones, or even have an understanding for it for yourself, you do it for yourself. You don't have to do it for somebody else. You can sit here right now and think about, what does it mean for me to die well and with dignity. It changes your grief trajectory, because you almost feel comforted that you did all the right things, um, or you probably were able to spend time with your loved ones the right way. We get a lot of questions, when people are passing away. They say, what's the right way to, what can I do? And we always say presence, because we've all gone through these moments. We've all been guilty of it, where when somebody passes away, we feel that if we fill the space with words, it's going to help. Any sentence that starts with at least doesn't work. Anything like saying at least they died in peace, at least they're in a better place. What does that mean? Does that mean that the better place was not with their loved ones? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. Saying things that it will get better. Try telling somebody that when they're in their acute grief stage. Words don't help. And I think what really helps is presence, to be able to sit down with someone next to them and hold space for them as a human. And I think we tend to forget that. We want to do something, we want to solve, we want to fix. That is in our human nature. And we've also spoken to a lot of people who have felt quite isolated because of that situation, because people are expecting them to get over it. We've heard people say, it's been 6 months. Why is this person still grieving? You might grieve for the rest of your life for someone that you love, and it might look different at different stages. But grief doesn't go away, because it's like what we say, like, grief is the price you pay for love. So, or care, or however you want to, whatever language you want to use, or whatever word that comes to mind. And so, as difficult as it is, I think grief is what we don't ask for, but sometimes I also think that grief is a privilege.
Right. And interestingly, you spoke about happiness when you just started right now. And does that also mean that it starts with, probably in this context, gratitude? Because you you get to a stage where you have to deal with grief, yes, but if you're living a life of gratitude where you wake up every day and you just need to be thankful that you've woken up, and build that positivity over time, you then realize that when it comes to happiness, which could be very momentarily something that you're striving for, uh, I always connect it to Kritika to, for example, if you ask a person about ambition and how ambitious is a person, as opposed to, you could be ambitious, but I mean, would you rather be aspirational? Because ambition has ABC, and you may have to, in the corporate world, walk or over and under. But if you're aspirational, then you're spreading much more energy around you, and you will probably get to where you, only you know where you need to get to, right? So these finer aspects that build into how you're then going to finally deal with grief. But that was my one point when you spoke about happiness. More importantly, I wanted to ask you, when you spoke about grief and having to deal with it, this is a real question. But why do men think or expect or believe that grief is something that they do not have to deal with directly, but it probably, we we tend to put on a braver, stronger front and say that, you know what, we have to get over this, and tend to probably cap it more than others do. And in all your research, in all your dealings that you've spoken to people, do you see that there is actually a clear divide here, that men tend to not know how to deal with grief for whatever reason, or whatever, or they're not dealing with it well? What is your take on this?
So, two questions. So, I'm going to answer that. I'm going to answer the first one. Um, you spoke about how we sort of look at gratitude, and I think, again, just like how we spoke about happiness, I think that there is, we also, I think there are ways that people are asked to practice gratitude, which can feel very mechanical. I'm glad I woke up today. I'm glad I have a glass of water to drink. I'm glad I have a roof over my head. Um, I think that sometimes those types of statements, when you're doing it without intentionality, it doesn't feel inspiring. But I think what happens with something like death and dying, and I think I've been on my own sort of journey because of MAAJHI. I think MAAJHI feeds me as much as we're doing the work towards the spirit of the offering. I think that the when you have intentionality in the way you live, I think then you're living a value based life, which means that if, let's say, your value is care, it'll show up, and you will show up to it in many ways. If your value is honesty, you will want to live your life based on that. And I think values are our foundation, and so they tend to take us, and they tend to inspire us, and they tend to motivate us way more than just a paycheck. Or you can do it. There's no problem about having that paycheck. Of course, it keeps that roof over your head in that sense. But I think going slightly deeper into what truly matters in this life for you enables you to search more deeply and go into that reflective mindset for yourself in terms of the quality of life you really, really want to live. Um, and for your second question, I I want to steer clear from gender because I think I'd like to believe, and I'd like to say that I've had equal, um, you know, equal sort of. I think I've just had a lot of people who have felt ready and have felt like they could approach MAAJHI in different ways. Um, I think from a cultural space, yes, there could be a difference between the way men and women are brought up. I think men have more pressure to hide their emotions, but I think it applies to everyone. I don't think that there is, I think society always has an answer for how we do anything, men and women, or any other gender for that matter. I think we have this written script of what things should be, and the word should is, it just needs to be taken out of the vocabulary. Um, because I think that when there is a mandate of how one must behave, you're not actually dealing with what is in front of you. It tends to be avoidant, and therefore I feel like, when we were talking about this earlier, that there is a space to, when grief hits, you don't know how it's going to hit you. So there is so much openness, or there's so many unknowns here. It's almost impossible to have a blueprint on how you're supposed to behave or how you're supposed to feel. Um, and I think that what helps, again, is to be more mindful, to be more understanding of oneself, and to also sort of approach it with less judgment. I think that, to tell people that there's a certain amount of time that you have to grieve, there is no timeline. Who put that timeline there? And I think this is what we need to keep questioning, and this is what we need to keep breaking down. And what you said about corporate life, I think I've had companies like Merck and Pfizer who have come to me, just extraordinary leaders who have wanted MAAJHI to be part of their offsites, or wanted MAAJHI to be part of their journey, because you get to go to the space of value, you get to go to the space of self-awareness. And I think it's wonderful to see. a corporate space that is probably focused on many other goals go into the space of self development or mindfulness in a different way. I think it allows the leadership to be uh, more compassionate or more aware. They get to be better leaders. Their employees get to be happier or more sort of heard or seen. And I think we need more humanness in the way we live our lives. Even though we're human, there are times we just behave so opposite of our nature. I think that just makes you come back to the nature that you've been given.
Yeah, I think that's a great word. That's one of my favorite words, in fact, humanness. And that's exactly what we're trying to get back to, hopefully. Or the moment we find concepts or ideals or values that you spoke about earlier that are closer to humanness, you naturally resonate, right? You find it easier to deal with. It somehow has a calming effect. And coming back to your part on grief and how people do deal with it now, a very interesting aspect here is something that constantly seems to be there, and that is fear. Now, this particular aspect of fear, as we've evolved, for example, we have people who have fears of heights and fears of snakes and insects, and so these are all at a surface level. However, the one thing that has constantly stayed with any generation, with any tribe, from the time we were tribes, right, has been the passing away of somebody in that community. We started with communities of 20 and 40, ideally 150, before we became this global big uh, group of as a community. Today, we all resonate and share with each other ideals from all over, and I think that's the way it should go, rather than concentrate on small aspects of where you live, right? That becomes very geographical, and I think that's something that we've done. But having said that, I think this particular emotion or this particular aspect of fear, which is universal, do you think has is one of the reasons that we were not able to tackle or speak about this earlier like you are doing today? Or what do you think was the reason that we held back?
I think there's a universal reason. Again, like I don't think there's a particular timeline to it, but I think that we have fear because there's a fear of the unknown. So we need to have, as bigger constructs in societies, we need to have stories, answers, an explanation. We need to have all these elements that come together to tell us why somebody passes, why we are going to die, why our loved ones are going to die. And I think it's the fear of the unknown that it's something that we can't control. There's so many things in my, for personally, for example, in my life that I can control. I can control the coffee I'm drinking right now. I can, we can control this conversation right now. We know what's going to happen at work on Monday morning. There is a sense of certainty in terms of routine and the way we live our lives. But in death, there's nothing. And nobody can explain to us what happens during that time. Nobody has come back to ever tell us that, what is a death experience like. And so I think that we're all looking for those answers, and that is why um, there is a certain level of uncertainty, and therefore that leads to a sense of fear. One of the things that we do in MAAJHI is I facilitate something called the instill death meditation. It is like an extension of Shavasana, or like the corpse pose in yoga, where it's a guided meditation which focuses on how a person might die from a spiritual, medical, philosophical, and emotional lens. And it's been one of the most uh, popular, or one of the things that people gravitate the most towards, because it's experiential and it allows people to maybe dip their toes in a less threatening way. It's because you're really taking this journey with yourself. And it's so interesting, again, that people come back to thinking about how they've lived life. Um, they come back to the insights that they come back with are really about understanding themselves a little better with the subject. Sometimes people have come to me saying, okay, now, now I feel like I need to spend more time with my family. I now realize that I need to work less. I now realize that I need to write my will. There's a sense of learning something about oneself, or feeling slightly. Sometimes people come to me saying, this experience made me feel like I need to fear this less. Like, and I started feeling less fear now. So I think that it sometimes feels a little intangible, but I think what we're really, again, trying to move towards is that sense of wholeness, that humanness, and accepting the fact that this is going to happen to us. Um, yeah.
Right. And interestingly, I just wondering while you were speaking that you're regularly having these conversations, Kritika. You're speaking to people who are probably telling you their stories and opening up to you. And you've been doing this over all these years. What is it like for you? Because I am having a conversation with you today, but I've had other conversations and then I'll go on to something else. So I kind of get a chance to uh, maybe distract myself or to just get out of a particular conversation. But for you, you're doing this regularly, right? And I'm just trying to understand, how does that impact you?
I think it's part inspiration and part self care. I feel very motivated and I feel very honored that I get to hold space and be in service of anyone who wants to be in the MAAJHI ecosystem. And I think what really inspires me is the fact that, again, MAAJHI is a value based organization. One is building with trust, one is building with a sense of care, one is building with a sense of empowerment and dignity. So I think that from the perspective of being there and being present to others, I think that that really fuels and inspires me to continue doing what I do. I think every conversation teaches me so much. I don't think it's a one-way street. I feel very fueled and fed by what I also hear in terms of taking care of myself. I think it's a process. Some days that you need more self care, and that self care can be, going to the things that also nurture me outside the space of MAAJHI. It could be music, it could be yoga and meditation, it could be writing. I have a lot of interests and hobbies, so I think that it could be connecting to loved ones. um, there are a lot of ways to really focus on my own care. But I think what's really important for me is that when I'm there with someone, it's not about me, it's about them. So I think that I'm very clear that my attention and my presence is for them. It's for their story, it's not for mine. So if I do feel grief coming up for myself, and that happens, it's natural that sometimes somebody's telling you something and you feel deeply empathic towards their story, or it's reminding you of something that might have happened in your life. One feels the tears, sometimes they roll down, and sometimes you grieve after the conversation. um, but I think I'm also learning to unlearn a lot while I'm on this journey, because just like everyone else, I've also had my share of grief, and I will continue to have my moments and share of grief. And so I try to be as human as possible.
Spoken like a true professional. So, yes, I'm sure that is the case. And you did mention about when you are dealing with these particular individuals, you would be giving them some kind of advice. And how interesting or how important is, when you're talking to somebody at this particular age or stage, is something like legacy. Because a lot of people want to think, whether you look at it as legacy, but what am I leaving behind, or what have I left behind? And does that come up? Because everybody does what they have to do, but it may be difficult to people, may need time or help to realize that they've done much more than they know they've done, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be what you've left materialistically for people around you, but the impact that you've had. And we spoke about earlier being aspirational, or living a fruitful life. So Would that be where the conversation would go rather than trying to count the pennies and pounds that are left behind?
I think for a lot of people, there's definitely a conversation about legacy. But I think for the people who sometimes come to Maji, there is a sense of wanting to understand themselves better and more deeply. And so legacy is one aspect of it. And I think when COVID, um, when COVID happened, I think a lot of people were also thinking about so many other aspects of their lives, like emotional, the social, the what their life really was adding up to. And so I think sometimes our conversations go very deeply into values, and how people are living that quality of life. Maji also did, we started something called the Obituary to Self many years ago, where it was a social campaign where we requested people to write their own obituaries, because what traditionally happens is that somebody else writes your obituary. Somebody will say, you know so and so is a great sister, a great aunt, a great wife, etc. But it's speaking more about in memory of. And what we thought was that an obituary is almost like telling a story about the life that you've lived. So why don't we get people who are here to write their own obituaries, and what might come out of it. And we had people from the age of 7 to 93 who wrote their obituaries. And it was remarkable to see that most people wrote about so much that they achieved in life. And I think sometimes when we talk about the word achievement, we immediately think about, did I do well, in my workspace? Or did I finish this college degree? Or there's something very, again, it becomes very goal oriented. But when you open up that conversation to how it has mapped out in your entire life, I loved what you said, because I think a lot of people realize that they've done so much more than just go through these achievements. There are so many moments that become center stage suddenly, without necessarily thinking that there is um, something to be achieved, or something that you need to sort of tick from your checklist in some way. And in the obituaries, it's such a beautiful spectrum, because I think there are lots of people who want to be remembered, who believe that they want to be remembered as someone who built a business, to someone who just wants to be remembered because she gave a shot at living life. Some people want to be remembered through um, you know their children. Some people want to be remembered by the charitable work they've done. And interestingly, there are some people who do not want to be remembered. They just want to live life and go wherever they're going next. And I think thinking about death actually makes you think about all those boxes in your life. You're not just thinking about one particular box that you're sitting in. Maybe it's bigger in a particular stage in your life. Like, let's say if you're a young professional, maybe the biggest box is actually getting into a market and sort of being self-sufficient, or earning well for your family, etc. But I think you don't necessarily lose sight of the other boxes. I think this is what the work is all about. That you live a whole life. You don't just live a part of it. Um, yeah.
Yeah. And this could be a strange question, but this is on my mind, so have to ask it. Is there any space for humor in this kind of environment, in this kind of. So I was just thinking of it because of something that I went through. But I mean, a lot of us use humor as a defense mechanism, and I tend to do that. But I think that there is a lot of space for that because that is also a human emotion. And if done rightly, if done correctly, with an intention in mind and with a goal, then my thought would be that it's a very strong tool. But I want to hear from you whether it even is valuable.
So about 10 years ago, I wrote my thesis on looking at the role of dignity in death and dying. And one of the one of the elements of looking at dignity for people, especially close to end of life, was humor. And I needed to read that a couple of times to see whether it was really making sense in my research. But humor is such a wonderful, it's such a wonderful sort of element to have. I think sometimes when we think about death, we always think that it is really dark and difficult and it's heavy. There's heaviness to it, which is completely understandable. But I think that I don't think I've ever spoken to people in my entire time of working, with MAAJHI or through Death Over Dinner or many other spaces in the space of grief, where I haven't heard people laugh, where there haven't been light moments. Because imagine if you're sitting here talking about the loss of a loved one and you remember something that they did, which you still find funny to this day, or maybe you remember a joke that they used to tell. It's light, it's beautiful. It doesn't mean that one is mocking death or you're mocking grief. I think it's a beautiful way to bring a sense of lightness, a sense of kindness, and a little bit of life back into the space of grief. I myself find a lot of, I myself tend to, cope a little bit with humor, but I think it's so required. I think that I like to believe that spaces of grief can have those moments of people smiling and feeling happy or remembering a loved one and just feeling joy because you're remembering them out of love or you're remembering them. I remember somebody telling me about how um, their parent, when they were passing away, made a list of um, had a list of people that they wanted to invite for their funeral, and they were like, this is a list of people I don't want you to invite, like let them find out when they have to. I mean, it's
Yeah.
hilarious. Like, this person
Yeah.
just wanted their wishes done to the T, and this was the level of detailing that sort of went into
Yes.
it, right?
Yes.
um I love
I
those
remember,
moments.
in fact, I remember just an incident that, as you mentioned, so this was when my dad had passed away. And so it was the final day, and, the funeral was on. And then I have a younger brother who's like 9 years younger than me. And suddenly I see him he goes and puts something in the pocket of my dad, who was, had passed away. So I got him later, and I said, "So what was all that about?" And so my dad was, all his life, every day that we knew him, he would solve these crossword puzzles. It used to come in these newspapers in those days. So he would bring a newspaper every day just to solve a crossword puzzle. And he was addicted to that. So my younger brother had torn a piece of the crossword puzzle from a newspaper, folded it, and put it into his pocket. And I found that funny. I found that strange. And I found that, okay, so he's got all the time now to sort this crossword puzzle because it's an infinite one. But it's just moments like this that you wonder that it doesn't necessarily have to be all that you think it is. But having said that as well, when it comes to this stage, Kritika, do you have to deal with people, or do you even get into a stage or phase where somebody asks you what next, and you then have to build some kind of, because it's better to be honest, like you said earlier, and we don't know, kind of, or yes. So that becomes a bit of a challenge dealing with, because I'm sure somebody would ask you, so what happens next, or how do you deal with that question?
You mean the afterlife?
Correct.
Okay. Sorry, I just also wanted to acknowledge, because grief doesn't have a timeline. I'm very sorry for your loss, and thank you for sharing that with me. um I think when it comes to the afterlife, Maji has taken a stand to be agnostic, and to be respectful of the kind of sentiments, religious, social, cultural, that people come from. Where, not there's no attempt to try to change somebody's understanding. Like, if somebody believes in that their person is going to heaven, that's okay. That's some, if that is what they believe, that is what they believe, and we meet the person where they're at. If somebody is not sure where that person's gone, I think the best way, and this is really my understanding, is I truly believe that the person goes into, it might sound a little cheesy to people, but I think that the person that you lose and miss, they become a part of you. And I almost feel like There's a, as much as you're holding the weight of that sorrow, you're also holding the weight of that love in yourself. And so that would be my understanding of where this person goes or where they might be going. um, and I think whatever makes people feel deeply comforted is what's important. However, I think one place that I sometimes feel cautious of is when people try to create a hierarchy of grief. Um, so let's say somebody says, oh, this person lost a pet versus losing a person. And there's a hierarchy saying, you know, a person is more important than the pet. It's probably not true. Someone losing um, a child versus a sudden death versus a suicide. I think David Kessler, who's a renowned grief expert, says this beautifully. He says when people ask, "What is the toughest grief?" He says it's yours. Nobody can. There's no scale that tells you whose grief is less or more. So I think being respectful towards grief and not comparing grief is very important. And I think sometimes in that anger or out of that, and it's natural for it to happen. I don't think it's a good thing or a bad thing. We tend to wonder whose weight of grief is more. I don't think that that is required. I think everyone's grief is, it's like a fingerprint. It's unique, and it's going to take them where it takes them. It just means that one has to be there in a loving way, and and that's what it takes.
Does rebirth come up? Because from what I've read, or what maybe I've just read it somewhere, but towards the end of people's lives, they tend to reflect is one, and but just not reflect on the life they've lived, but probably reflect on the life they could have lived or believe they lived. Or so, does this come up, and is this anything that you have to deal with?
Well, sometimes I hear people talking about their regrets, but I hear that for people who are, you know, healthy and are in the living phase of their life as well. What I've heard and what I've noticed the most about people who are close to death and dying, a lot of people come to me because sometimes they're more ready than the people around them, and the people around them are not willing to have a conversation with them. It can be somebody who they're medically dealing with, it can be a family member, it can be, and they feel that they have this sense of ambiguity and they don't know what to do with their final months or their final year. They feel like they have no, but sometimes they feel like they don't have someone to speak to say that I've accepted this, but nobody around me is accepting it. What do I do? Or I'm afraid. What do I do? And so sometimes, you know, in service of that, we focus on what is required for the person in that point in time. Is it a session like one-on-one like this? Is it about doing the death meditation? Is it some other tool that we build for them? We have a lot of you know, experiences that we build in. There could just be sitting in the presence of that person. It could be talking to one of their family members. It really is very personalized in that moment for the person. But I do feel that a lot of people, um, especially people who are dying, are sometimes more ready to go, and are more prepared in their own way compared to the people around them, because the people around them are the ones who are, you know, going to be left behind, and they're going to be holding that, the grief, and they're going to be holding that loss. um, I have had some very beautiful poignant moments where people who were close to passing did a death meditation, and after they passed away, after the death meditation, they sent me a note to say, can you please send this to my family once I'm gone? And I would do that. And it sometimes gave the families such a huge sense of relief, knowing that this person was really ready, or knowing that this person said that they were going to be fine. Sometimes I feel like it's the person who's leaving who's kind of consoling the room around them. Um, and those have been very beautiful moments, very humbling moments. Um, Not just, you know, doing MAAJHI in terms of my mainstream work, but just witnessing. I think I get to witness a lot of human vulnerability, and it is such a strong place to be. I think people look at vulnerability as a weakness and we box it in. I actually think it's one of the deepest strengths that we have.
These days, listicles are very popular, whether
Mm.
it is online, whether it is 7 ways to do ABC or 6 ways to whatever. So, do you have some kind of a listicle that you think or you would put in, not necessarily priority or in any order, but you would say these are the 3 or 4 things that, as a starting point, if somebody is interested in what we've just been speaking or just wants to deal with this, there's something that you can do on your own. And if you do these 3, 4, 5, 10, whatever you say, you're kind of preparing yourselves to be on the right path.
I think it's so important to ask yourself what truly matters in your life, and not in terms of this is how much that needs to be in the bank. Like, if you remove some of the tangible parts of that, what is truly important? Is it quality time with someone? Is it quality time with yourself? Is there something you've been wanting to do that you don't seem to have the time for? It's really about almost looking at your life right now to see what's really working, and what do you feel is feeling like, what is causing anxiety, what is causing a sense of sadness, what is causing something that doesn't make it feel right. For example, I still do go through anticipatory grief, thinking about the loss of loved ones. It's a tough place to be, and I think, whether we are about to experience it, or we haven't gotten to that point yet, or we are at that point, or we are dealing with the fact that it happened, that sense of anticipatory grief, I think, can be reframed as what is being asked of you to prepare for. So does that relate to spending more time with the people that you love? Is it about having those difficult conversations with them? Is it about starting to think about how you'd like to take care of them? The conversation goes into many spaces. I always like to say that Maji is really building an ecosystem. It isn't just about one place, one kind of offering, and that's about it. It really seeps into every part of life, and death and grief. And so one needs to, I think that one can start by asking those questions of what is important to them. The other thing that I like to ask people is possibly the opposite. What do you not want? What is something that you don't want happening to you? So, because that's really where regret comes from, right? That if if this happens, I might regret it. So what is that? If I don't do this, or if I don't think about this, or if I don't prepare for this, this is going to happen. It's almost like you're you're trying to cast yourself forward to think about what you might regret in the future, and that could help. So one question, especially when it comes to death and dying, when people say, I'm scared of dying, I sometimes ask people what a good death looks like. And they say, there's nothing. They tend to get a little agitated sometimes, or it it strikes something uncomfortable for them, and they'll say, there's no such thing as a good death. We're like, okay, so then what does a bad death look like? Let's start with that. And then people will say, dying in the hospital, dying alone, dying in pain, um, not being able to say the things you wanted to say, etc. And then you say, okay, fine. Then you flip that and you say, okay, then what is a good death? You've told me what a bad death is. What is a good death? Is it the opposite of what you're saying is a bad death? And then people will say, dying with loved ones, telling people how much you love them, maybe dying at home, uh, having everything in order so that my loved ones don't need to struggle after I'm gone, um, spending time with my dog. It can be so many beautiful things. And that's when you realize that sort of self awareness comes into, this is going to be a part of my life that I'm leaving behind. It is not death that is going to happen. It is what I've done with my life so far that is going to sort of come to a stop. And I think that people then sort of lean in a little bit. And I think the language of loss like I said, I think everyone knows it. It's really about tapping into it because it brings a sense of kindness and vulnerability that we think we don't have. A lot of people have come to me before, you know, speaking to them saying, I don't know if I can talk about death. I don't know if I'll be good at it. Um, and I always say that, this is, you won't even realize how good you are at it. You'll come in, you'll start talking, and you'll have the words, and you'll have the emotions, and you will have whatever it is that you come in with. And I've never, I find it really, when I think back to all the amazing people that have interacted with Maji, I can't think of a single person who didn't do a great job of talking about what they wanted to talk about or feeling what they wanted to feel.
Right. And coming to the psychology of what you do, what about personality types? Now, there are introverts and extroverts and left brain and right brain, and then we can go down to the seven basic personality types and then 12, 14. But have you seen that there are certain personality types that tend to deal with grief better? So you're intrinsically built with that resilience, maybe, or if it's the opposite of resilience as far as grief is concerned, I guess you've got to let go, right? So, y- are we able to map personality types with grief and how each type could probably deal with grief?
Great question. I think for me, the way we approach Maji is that it is an offering that is available to everyone. I think a lot of people come to Maji when they feel like something has happened or when they feel ready to talk about it. So I think of it more in terms of readiness more than a personality type, because you can't force someone who's scared of talking about death to want to talk about it. If someone doesn't want to talk about it, no matter what their personality type you can't get through. And the idea is not to go through this with fierce marketing or journalism or sensationalism, right? You can't go up to somebody and say, "Oh my God, you're gonna die soon. Don't you want to do anything about it?" I mean, it could work for some people, that jolt, but I don't think that that is necessarily the most sustainable way to approach a person in a human way. So I think that we always say that, you meet people where they're at and you focus on their level of readiness. There's some people who will, I also sometimes tend to get um, unpleasant messages saying that, what you're doing is wrong, or um, I think it's really unkind that you sit and talk about death, or, you're bringing it on. Why are you doing that? Why are you talking about it? And again, it's a space for me to listen and understand where that person is coming from. And they might not be ready for Maji, and Maji is not ready for them. So it's okay. They don't have to enter the space. I've had people who've come after 2, 3 years who've messaged me saying, I wasn't ready then to understand what you were doing, but now I get it. And I'm like, great, like here's the door, you're welcome in. Um, and I think that sometimes, and this is why some of the Maji tools, we've designed them from the perspective of, can you go on a journey with yourself? Can you sit in a group and talk about this? Can you be an individual talking to me? We've given people different tools and experiences to apply it in their own understanding, in their own way, and in their own time. Some people are very interested in the death meditation and they'll come for that, but they don't want to be part of a group conversation. Some people rather be in a group because they want to listen in and they want to be part of a community kind of setting. So they come for that, but they may not do the death meditation. Someone else might want to have um, a lot of people kind of ask me for resources. They'll say, I read this book, can you discuss this with me? And I'm happy to discuss it more at an intellectual, philosophical level with them. I think it's really about understanding where they are at. But I'm I'm very clear that I don't need to convince people that they need to talk about this. I'm not looking to. I mean, of course, the death literacy part is important, so I will keep doing my work. And I think people find Maji, and people oftentimes have surprised me in terms of what Maji can do, and maybe they give me an idea I've never even thought about because I'm thinking about it one way, and they come in and say, "Hey, can you would you consider doing this? Like we recently did a workshop at a hospice, which was absolutely beautiful. And I couldn't have done it without the brains of the people in the hospice and, mental health practitioners who came together to put together such a beautiful workshop. So I think it's really about meeting people where they're at. I don't feel the requirement to chase or convince um, anybody that they need this.
Right, right. And so recently, I've been following a lot of what I don't know if you've heard about Bernardo Castro, but what he talks about is a lot about analytical idealism. And the only reason I found a connection here with what conversation we were just having is the basic tenet of that is life is never about you to start with, first of all. And if that is understood, then I don't know if it makes it easier, but that's a very powerful statement that you you probably do not know uh, what you are doing, and we spoke about that earlier, right? And uh, a caterpillar making a cocoon doesn't really know it's a butterfly finally, right? It's not doing that because it's going to become a butterfly. So it does what it has to do, and it ends there. But that would probably be a more difficult way to speak to someone, or do you think that that's interesting as well?
Wow. Um, I think what happens is when somebody else is grieving, when it's not your grief um, directly, we tend to be very universal and we tend to be very philosophical. I think this happened to a lot of people during COVID as well, right? Till it happened to you, till something personal, deeply personal happened to you, there was a sense of wanting to hold space for others because there was a little sense of distance. But then when it's about you, it's really personal, and like, when we go back to the stories, we say, this happened to my person because the doctor prescribed this medicine and it didn't work and this person passed away. um, this happened because we took somebody to a hospice and not a hospital. This is what happened because somebody died at home. If this person hadn't eaten this today, life would have been different. We find these ways to want to tell a story that makes sense. And as painful as it is, I think it is that moment of wanting control so that we can make sense of something that is hardly understood. And I think that's the difficulty of grief and loss. And I think that that is also in some ways the beauty of grief and loss, that it has it has moments which can really feel unfair. And it probably does, it always probably does at some level. But I think it also allows us to find meaning. It's like what you said about, the caterpillar becoming that butterfly. Doesn't know it's going to happen. And I think that there's something almost poetic about the fact that life isn't about us. We come here, we live it. We don't know why we're born. We don't know why we live life the way we do. And therefore, we also kind of don't know why we die the way we do. There's such big existential questions that I think that sometimes there's a little relief in putting those questions down and saying, you know what, I don't know. And it's okay. And I think we have a very, very hard time saying saying that it's okay that we don't know. We need to have an answer for everything.
Yeah.
And this is what I find so interesting about death too, that even though we don't know enough about this unknown, you can ask anybody what they think about death and they will have many opinions about it. So it reminds me of a quote which I wanted to read out to you. If you don't mind, I'll
Yeah,
open it
please.
out to you. Sorry, I'm just taking a second.
Yep,
Um,
take it.
there's a gentleman called Oliver Berkman, who's an author and journalist, and he talks about the book is called Meditations for Mortals. And in that, he says, but agnostics and atheists get to take a different path to a similar destination. If there isn't a God, then there's no authority with the power to demand that you earn your right to exist. You just do exist. And that has to be sufficient. As the Taoist writer Jason Gregory explains, expressing the same idea in a different and powerful way, we fall into the error of believing that we somehow don't belong to the world and must therefore spend our lives trying to earn back the right to belong. But who could ever decide we don't belong? The obvious truth is that we already do. This isn't sentimentalism, just a hard nosed statement of the facts.
Beautiful. And really nice, because obviously there is some connection with consciousness here. I'm talking about human consciousness, because when we talk about existence and when we talk about metacognition and we having the power to reflect and introspect, so we've approximately, I think it's about, we've had 700,000 generations since you and me are having this conversation, right? There have been 700,000 generations that have come and have gone. But there, it depends. I think Carl Jung spoke about collective unconsciousness, where do we carry some kind of memory? Do we carry some kind of? I was speaking earlier about uh, fear, and that was what I was referring to when I said that in the ancient times, people did have certain fears, and though we don't live in the jungles anymore, we still tend to have the same fears, as though it was in an urban apartment or something. But uh, with the beautiful statement that you just read out, it does come back to that ultimately, right? It's just you and your thoughts at the end of the day, because what's to guarantee anybody else that anything, and I'm getting a little bit diverted here, but what I'm trying to get at is, you know what you're going through because you know one thing that you're sure about, and that is your emotion and your consciousness. Everything else is, there's no proof for it. So when a person is going through that grief, you've got to let the person go through that in some way or the other, rather than defending and putting telling somebody you need to put a brave front. All that is fine, but you, I'm still going through it, and the better way to do is to do deal with it is let that happen. And it was interesting that you mentioned that it takes time for people, and while they are grieving, right, it could be quick for someone, it could be, and there are certain people who probably, and this is actually for you, is there, or are there people rather who deal with the situation immediately, and then probably 4 years down the line, you know, snap and start grieving because at that moment they were probably not able to.
Mhm.
Does that happen as well?
Oh, it does. It's called prolonged grief or delayed grief, right? Where you could be dealing, let's say that somebody, I'm just giving an example. Let's say somebody has been terminally ill in the family for many months, maybe years, and you have just been in the cycle of dealing with the everydayness of it. When they pass away, there can be this huge vacuum of having to get back to a routine which wasn't known to you for a long time. So you get busy getting into that routine, or maybe because you knew that the end was coming and you were prepared for it in some way, in your own way. Um, I don't think anyone is ever not shocked at that moment of death, even though they see somebody through a prolonged, uh, grief journey. I think that moment of death is always, or tends to always be, um, shocking because it's the final moment is sort of here. Um, and I think sometimes people tend to get really busy. They tend to still be in that mode of, what do I have to do next? And there's so many um, logistical things to deal with, right? There could be property that you're dealing with, there could be bank statements, there are death certificates. There's so much of the logistics around grief that sort of come into play, that there are times where you almost feel like you can only grieve once all of this is behind you in some way. And that's what I mean, that when I say that there's no timeline for grief, um, while there are some spaces which require um, possibly medical attention. I'm not a medical professional, but I do understand that there are spaces of complicated grief where some people can absolutely not function in their day to day tasks because they're so deep in their grief that they might need some kind of medical intervention to support them through that time. um, but I think that it can happen that, the example I can think of is being in a grocery store doing something completely mundane, and suddenly hearing um, a song that a loved one used to sing, or smelling, like our senses sometimes pick up on these things. Like you could probably um, get a whiff of a perfume that your loved one would wear, and the next minute you're crying. It's like a crash of grief that suddenly happens, and maybe that opens up the entire door, and maybe sometimes it's just that moment. It happens, and it can happen. It's like a grief burst. It can happen at any point in time. I just don't think that we allow for those things to happen. When we talk about bereavement leave or support, we tend to say, okay, like the immediacy when the grief is acute, that's usually the time it's given to a person. But then, you come back into work and you have to almost act like nothing's happened, or you come back into any of your life situations, not necessarily work, and then you're almost supposed to behave like it didn't happen. But how do you behave like something hasn't happened when one of the most important things has happened to you? Your life has changed. And I think that when you were talking, the phrase that came to me was when people say be strong. What are you trying to be strong for? Who are you trying to be strong for? Or they'll say things like, your loved one wouldn't have wanted you to be sad. You can say that maybe later. I don't know if the time is right, depending on how close somebody is. But of course your loved one doesn't want to be sad, but you are going to be sad. You are going to miss them. It's something. You're almost expecting somebody to who's gone through something so large to now be tasked with being strong and being okay. No, they're not going to be okay. And I think we all, as people around the people that we love, or when we are grieving, I think we need to give ourselves and each other permission to not be okay. I don't think we don't like not being okay.
Right. And also, we do hear, and you will be aware of certain civilizations or certain older tribes where they take this totally to the other end, right? There are celebrations, and that's an interesting way to look at it as well, because they do not, or they do probably, there is grieving there as well, but there is a tradition that you also have to deal with. And having said that, I just want to get back to you mentioning terminally, somebody who's terminally ill versus a sudden death. Now, these are two totally different cases, because I assume that if there is a terminal illness, then there is time for preparation, and probably you realize where the whole thing is. However, when it comes to sudden death, then this prolonged grief that you spoke about may kick in, because it's a sudden reaction, and you just don't have time to, not time to grieve, but you've not had time to probably internalize. You've not, it's not yet
Yep.
hit you, you know. So is that also a reason why, if there is probably a question on sudden death, that there are more cases where the grieving is difficult, or these cases need more help?
Again, I think it's a case by case basis. um, I definitely think that a sudden death, um, there's such a cruelty to it, in terms of people, like you said, there's just no time to think. um, with terminal illness, maybe there is more time to prepare and think about it. And this is why I believe that there is no time, coming back to what you initially asked, like when is the right time to prepare. I don't think there's This is why I sometimes feel like there is no right time. You're never going to get a signal of when it's going to happen, why it's going to happen. So it's so important for us to be mindful that anything can happen at any point in time. So at least knowing some of those practical wishes, something as simple, I have a lot of young people who will come and say, I don't feel like I spend enough time with my family. I'm not able to be on the dinner table with them because um, I'm working, and I feel like I'm going to regret it. So it's like, what's one way that you're not going to regret this? Like, if tomorrow something were to happen to them, you're going to actually feel bad that you did not spend those dinners with them, because it sounds like I'm hearing that regret from them. It can sometimes be in the smallest ways that you want to continue to honor any aspect of life of your own or your loved ones in that process. I think the only unfortunate antidote, but it's in our hands, is to prepare, is to be as prepared as one can be in so many aspects. And like you said, sometimes I think we talk more about the when you think about someone writing a will, you're thinking about very tangible aspects of what is important. And I think now, banks and insurance companies, they're doing enough to talk about the nominee beneficiary. Even those things are sort of, getting taken care of. But I think a lot of times we don't think about the other things that matter to us, like the emotional aspects, or what is someone going to do with all their stuff? What are they going to do about the things that they love? And during COVID, one of the exercises that I was encouraging people to do was, because COVID was a time of such high uncertainty of who was going to get it, whether someone would have, um, medical facilities around them, would if people would have support, if families would see each other again. There was this whole, it just stopped every aspect of our lives, right? Like I think everyone was on Zoom and everyone was just online with each other because we didn't have any other way to be with each other. I encourage people to think about going through some of their things, to think about what would happen if you were in this position where you would not be there. What would happen to all your things? What would happen to, and it was interesting, like some of my friends messaged me because I started the conversation and they said, "Oh, I'd love to take your books." And I still have post-its in my boxes of books to say that this would go out to so and so, should something happen to me. And one can look at it in a very morbid way. um, but I actually, it was such a connecting moment with this friend of mine, because I didn't know that this person wanted my library of books. um, and by the time COVID was done, I realized I didn't want some of the books, but I gave it to him anyway. But I think that these are the ways that we can sort of be mindful. I think being aware that death is going to happen. As David Kessler says, there's 100% guarantee of death.
Yeah.
It's not, it's a whole statistic. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
there's no one who's come out of it in any other way.
Yeah.
Even Han Solo would have at some point gone.
You've
uh,
gone. Yeah.
yeah, so it's so important to be mindful of the fact that anything can happen in any time. And I think that, when people say that, I think the reframe in our minds needs to be less about the fear, but to say it in a way that anything can happen at any time.
Mm.
So here's my list, here's the things I'm going to do, instead of saying anything can happen at any time and then feel debilitated because of that. And and i can and I can say that I sit on both sides of it. Sometimes we really fear things, and it's human. And sometimes that fear can convert into actually taking a chance, into actually doing the things we want to do. And that's really, it's strange. It sits on the same side. It's just the way, which side you're kind of looking, and which direction you're sort of pointing yourself towards.
Right. On a lighter note, you spoke about will, and there's a saying I heard that whenever there is a will, there are always relatives. So the different types of the different types of looking at will. So you can look at the will as the will to, like Schopenhauer said, the will to move on, or the if wherever there is a will. I mean, I found that quite interesting. But also, having said that, Kritika, I think with Maji, the way I can see it is you're kind of preparing people, or you would want to prepare people to have this one more window open, or to have this one more avenue open, which you will anyway have to have one day. Because if you look at our cognitive brain, or you look at the way we function, we have different parts of our brain uh, dealing with, it could be happiness, it could be fear, it could be whatever, but not necessarily grief. And if you don't start getting something ready, it's a, you would call it probably a mutual fund, right? Where you keep putting in, and then you get the benefit at some time. So if you know it's inevitable, then you start getting this small space in your head ready. Just an empty space. You can let it be empty for some time, but you start creating space for it, because when things have to happen, then it's easier for those neurons to flow in there, rather than, if it's not there, it's going to go in all directions looking for space, and that's going to affect your life, that's going to affect your family, that's going to affect everything else, because you don't have that place ready. And I just thought of this analogy. What do you think of it?
It's really beautiful, and I'm going to steal it from Aji. I will give you credit, of course, for your genius. So thank you. Um, but I completely believe in that. And in fact, the more I have spent time speaking about death and dying, and the more that I've immersed myself in this space, I feel like I can have lighter moments about it. I feel like when we talk about it in our family, there's so much humor. When we talk about what it means to die well, sometimes we'll joke about, how if someone has any titanium in them because of, some surgery, that we should remove it and keep it before, they get cremated. These are light ways to invite the conversation in, or somebody says, if you don't do this, or like, I will come and haunt you for the rest of your life if you don't do this. Like, we have these lighter moments to talk about
Yeah.
it. And I feel like having that little window open is really not, it's not going to take the pain away. Like, many times people say, can I come to you and can you fix my pain? It can't fix pain. I can't take grief away. But what one can do is to witness it, because grief needs to be witnessed. This is one of the most important things that I have come to learn, is that so many times when someone is grieving, the fact that they've lost someone, now you're adding pressure on it to say this person should be over it by now. Why aren't they over it? You're creating a layer of shame. Now, and a lot of times people don't want to speak about their loved ones who have passed away, because now they don't exist. People don't know how to hold that conversation. So now you stop talking about them. And so there are these layers and layers of isolation that we build, which, where, where we actually need connection. So when people talk to me about them losing someone, I I feel I feel so happy when they actually mention the person's name. I feel so happy that they're talking about them like they're still a loved one. Fine, they're in a past tense, but they're still a loved one. And I think we forget that when we go through the stages of our grief, or how we have to do it from the outside for the rest of the world. And it makes me think about how, oftentimes it's said that there are three times that you die. One is when you actually, your body physically dies. The second is, if you believe in a soul, that when your soul is sort of, the second is your soul. And the third one is when people stop talking about you.
Mhm.
And I think that when people stop talking about you, it's on everyone else. It's on everyone else to kind of keep you here if they choose to, right? Um, and I think that the more I have spoken about, and the more immersed I get into the space of death and dying, I feel like I'm actually having a conversation about life. And I feel like when people hear the word death, they only think of the worst things. They tend to not understand that you're actually talking about so many things that your life has been. Imagine standing, if one had to visualize this, like, imagine standing at the end of your life on the other side, and imagine what you see about your life. You're not going to see this. I hope, I'm really hoping in this visualization that people are not going to not see anything. I think they're going to see the people they love. I think they're going to see the way they laughed, the way they really lived their life. um,
Yeah.
and I think that is, and I do want to say this because it's really important. I was a very death fearing person many years ago. If anyone even said the word to me, I would start crying. If my parents ever said when we die, it became, it just, the whole house would come down, because I just could not. I felt that I was reacting out of not knowing. the space and not interacting with it and not knowing what I was afraid of. But I'm so grateful that it, I don't know, maybe this was the way to come into my calling. It almost became a fear that became real. And now I feel very nourished by what I'm learning and unlearning and sort of making sense. And I too have days where I feel like I may not be able to cope, and I have days where one can. So I really want to say that because I feel like a lot of people tend to think that just because you're doing this, you're seasoned, and therefore you haven't gone through the difficult pieces that they go through. And I'll never go through what somebody has gone through exactly, but I think all of us, um, I think there's a journey to it, and I don't think it's like going from 0 to 100, and that's about it.
Yeah. And interestingly, you mentioned about looking back, and if you could look back, what do you see? There is, I don't know if you heard of Ray Kurzweil, who is a gentleman who's been collecting all data points of his life, his parents, everybody, and building this data bank because uh, he believes that post his passing away, he will still live on digitally. And with the way and how AI is going today, I don't think so. We are far away from when people will actually be able to reflect or look back with the kind of information we are collecting. But that again, that depends on which way we want to go with AI, and do people want to go down this direction, which I think it should be considered because it's probably similar, right? Because if you have information about a person, if you have everything that you need to know, and today we do, maybe in 30, 40 years from today, you could continue to live digitally and you could look back at everybody's life and run through, fast forward and pause, and the interesting parts and the not so interesting parts, and you could immortalize yourself in a way. And maybe then it would be easier to deal with it because it may not necessarily be the real closure, but there is some kind of, okay, this is where it all ends and this is where it's going. But it's like having an album of something that you've always thought about, and but when you go through the album, you it kind of consolidates, right? What do you think about the AI connection to the next possibility of what you're doing?
I think digital immortality is a new narrative that has come in, especially when it comes to looking at AI and where it's going today. I I have many reservations about it in some ways. I'm open to seeing where it goes, but I think it's so important for us to, just like how we're looking at responsible AI in so many spaces, in healthcare, in financial services, in any way that we're actually engaging in AI in our lives. I think it's extremely important and to be responsible and ethical in how we create afterlives. Um, there's a great example recently about Daniel Kahneman who passed away, and he passed away in a way that felt true to him, and it was a very personal. He took, he's a public figure, but he was very personal about the way he passed away, and it was only much later that people found out that he passed away the way he did, and the public had there were lots of different opinions about the way he died, and I don't think it was anybody's business. And I think that there's always a double-edged sword when somebody is a public figure. If a public figure does not want to be remembered, they don't have the choice because someone will want to remember them, someone will want to immortalize them. Um, and similarly, I think when it comes to digital immortality, I think there are lots of movies and documentaries that are being made of showing what happens when people start getting attached to um, the digital avatar that you're creating. Let's say if you tell somebody that you never have to grieve because your loved one will always be with you. Now, the person who's living as a human being right now versus a person who has passed and lives in an immortal state, what is that relationship going to look like on a societal level? Um, what if the large language model starts to hallucinate and create a different personality for itself, or starts saying things that it never did say before. Um, what if something happens to the system and your avatar for some reason vanishes? You know, it's going to create a different kind of, I'm curious to actually understand this more from mental health experts in terms of what is this going to do to the way that we are emotionally and mentally. um, and I think the other question that I'm curious to understand from people is, what what do you who are you wanting to be immortal for? You can say that, I want to leave this for my children, I want to leave this for my grandchildren. Who's going to take care of your immortal self when you are gone? Does this mean that you're going to fund it? Do you think somebody in your life is going to fund it? It comes down to a lot of other questions when it comes to building it from a business standpoint. um, what is the purpose of immortalizing oneself? Who are you doing it for? What are you doing it for? And what do you hope it achieves? Because in some ways, you want to immortalize yourself, but you're not here anymore. So, how are you going to know that, how do you know that you being immortalized is being utilized, if I can use a business term here? So it's interesting. I know that we're all heading in these directions where a lot of these softwares and a lot of this kind of technology can be very appealing, and it can really pull people in, given the vulnerable state that people might find themselves in, especially in the space of grief. But I'm still waiting to watch where the human aspect of it is going to remain, because I don't think I don't think we can deal with death and dying and grief without the human centeredness of what we need to bring to the table.
Right. And just to check with you, because you are currently operating out of Canada, right?
Canada and India, I
And India.
split my time
So,
between them.
if, right. Now, for people listening to this conversation, if they need to find out more about MAAJHI, if they need to get in touch with you, if there is something that they can get involved in, uh, what would you lead them to? Or your work, if people want to read or listen to you a little bit more, where would you direct them?
Sure. The best place to start is my website. It's www.maji.com, and there are many resources there. I think that's a good starting point.
Okay. And again, I just wanted to check with you because I was, while we were talking, I was wondering, is that a four-string guitar there? And do you play the guitar?
It's my ukulele.
It's your ukulele, right? And that's that's what I was wondering. I said, okay. And is that, sorry, I've got, is that a Christmas tree?
Yes. So this is my forever Christmas tree, as you can
Oh,
see.
lovely. Beautiful.
I love
Beautiful.
Christmas, and I didn't want to keep getting. I never liked the idea of having to cut down a tree or to have to throw it out after Christmas. And this is. I was lucky to find this beautiful wooden tree that just stays in my house through the year. So it's a tree when it needs to be, and it's a Christmas tree when I want it to be. So yeah.
Brilliant. Brilliant. So, Kritika, this is your time now, and I think you've been amazing while we've been speaking. And I just want to check with you: is there some kind of message that you want to put out there? People listening to you, and I think most of our listeners are in the age group of like 18 to 22, 23. We do have people who are also listening because they're very formulative years for them, when it comes to careers, when it comes to what they believe in, their values. And with so much happening around today, everyone's trying to find the ultimate truth, everyone's trying to find the literal truth, everyone's just trying to find a space for themselves, and how they tackle not only grief on a basis where it's to do with health, but it's about, we also talk about disappointments, we talk about failures. And I think if, to an extent, you take these small steps to start dealing with failure, to start dealing with uh, not being able to perform to expected standards that has been set up by somebody else. These are just small steps that we take because you use the word unlearning, and it's very important. It's very important for us to unlearn. Probably by the time we get to an age or stage in our lives when we know we have the ability and the control to now learn and unlearn what we want, because up to a particular age there's no choice, right? You kind of have to go with it, and you absorb everything that's been told. So what is the message that you would want to pass out there, and how would you frame that?
I think we are in a place today where there's a lot of grief and there's a lot of anticipatory grief. There's a lot of difficulty out there, and there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of what's going to happen to jobs, what's going to happen to the way we live life, what's going to happen to livelihoods. There's a lot of, if I can use the word, pain that is currently in our ecosystems, and there's a lot of fear because of it. I think what's going to keep us going is our humanity. I think what's going to keep all of us grounded is really focusing on what our values are calling out for. I think many of us feel like the first thing we have to do is just find a job, and it doesn't matter how miserable we are in it, we're just going to do it. It might be a short term solution. It is definitely a direct path to being unwell or not feeling like you're in your state of well being. So I really feel that so much of how we sustain ourselves is through our values, through what really matters to us. And I do believe that when we think like that, we create more opportunity for the space to do well, to feel well, and really take ourselves along. I think it's so important that we are part of that journey in a very active way, where we put ourselves first, to know that if we don't do our work, the things around us don't really function. Um, and it's definitely easier said than done with the pressures of what is going on today in so many aspects of our lives. But I definitely think that there's a quiet strength in seeking spaces of silence, of reflection, of intention, um, in a culture that just believes in being quick and being noisy. I think listening to yourself is a real gift.
Right. And I'm just
And also,
wondering if,
sorry to add, we're all there. We're all there for people who are growing up. We're all here. We've made a million mistakes and we're still here. So, yeah.
yep, we've made a million mistakes. And the way I look at it is we tend to, or the way I look at it, this is my view now. So we tend to give, I tend to talk about what we need to do as far as keeping the world or getting the world to be a better place. And I talk to my kid and my son, he's now 20. And besides him and whoever I get a chance to. And I've always sat back and wondered that the fact of the matter is we actually messed it up, right? So we are not really in a position, or I'm not really in a position to tell the next generation on how to get stuff cleaned up, because if we knew how to do it we wouldn't have left the world in the way we are, right? So I think there's something to that as well, because we could have, I think we could have done a better job. We could have, but that's not on the subject or topic that we're currently speaking about. This was just a thought that came to my mind.
But I actually, what you just said, I think, and again, this is my opinion. This is
Yeah.
not, so I hope you're not going to get pushed back on this. But I think during COVID, um, I think the fact that many of us were forced almost to sit with ourselves and to really think about what was important to us, there was a part of me that felt that it was one of my biggest takeaways, saying that, wow, like now people are going to feel like silence matters to them, that doing the things that are important to them matters, their health is important, being more environmentally conscious, like so how so many people said, Mumbai became so much cleaner and there was less pollution, you could hear the birds. And at that time, I was living in Mumbai. I was, what really was shocking to me in terms of sentiment was how people, when COVID started easing up, went into this moment of revenge buying and revenge vacations. It was, again, like, when we said, like, it's not personal, it's not about you. Like COVID happened to everyone. um, but I felt quite disheartened in that moment that so many people sort of bounced back with a vengeance rather than feeling like they had these quiet moments, they had these life realizing moments. There was, and so much of, I think so much of what we evolve into sometimes comes out of suffering and adversity. And I think in many ways, I felt like it was a missed moment where we could have really tapped into our humanity. And I'm sure many of us did. But I also realized that many people didn't.
Oh yeah, I think it was a big missed opportunity because a lot of us were aligned, right? We were going in that direction. There was real change when we talk about change, and people were beginning to bring out conversations. I think one of the beautiful things that, if if we could say, that came out from there was what you're doing with Maji. So there were small islands of people who were able to keep going, because once things normalized, like you said, there was the immediate reaction and people kind of forgot what happened the previous day. But having said that, this and your conversation, what you are actually doing as well, is one of those bright spots that came out, and that you have persevered with what you're doing. So it's amazing that you're doing what you're doing. First of all, like I said at the beginning of this conversation, when I read what you are doing, I was the first thing that came to me was, that's brave. And that's the real word that I use. And the fact that you're able to articulate your ideas so well, whether it's a framework which I was asking you about, or whether it is something that's probably subjective and people are just looking for more meaning. So you've got that as well in place. And what are what are your next plans, Kritika? What do you plan to do? Where do you see yourself going from here? And anything that you think we should be prepared for?
Thank you. Those were many, many kind words. So I really appreciate it. I think for me, what I really would like to do with Maji is build an organization. I mean, it's already there, but we're continuing to build it based on a value system of trust, of humanism, if I can call it that. And I think what I'm hoping to do is to build an organization that really focuses on measuring social impact while also having business outcomes so that one can be sustainable, one can have, and maybe something like this doesn't, we're still building the business model in that sense, right? So it's a lot of collaboration. We're very multidisciplinary, so it's really about finding the right partnerships and finding the right spaces to be in, so that we can be in service sustainably. um, and I think this is going to move into Maji's kind of in the works with writing books, focusing on a lot of educational material. There's a product that we're looking to build. And, as I was saying in the beginning, initially, Maji started with only focusing on end of life care, but we've moved into the spaces of aging, end of life care, of course, grief, loss. So it's sort of much larger. And, my background has been in working in health and life sciences at an analytics company. I was heading the behavior design and research aspect of the work. So I think there's a huge trail of my thinking which has gone into, healthcare, development sector, and of course impacting all the areas that I spoke about. So one is waiting for the spirit of Maji. I genuinely believe that I'm working for the spirit of Maji. It's not me. It's what she calls out for in some way, and it's what I'm responding to. I'm in service of her, and I'm in service of where it's taking me. And I'm grateful for that journey so far.
That's beautiful. And Kritika, as always, I think I have to tell you that I don't even know how long we've been talking, but wow, it's been 2 hours. So
These are the
I
best
think
kinds
we
of
planned.
conversations where you
Wow,
lose
we
track of time.
I thought we planned for an hour, and I just okay. But anyway, the important thing is, I think it was great talking to you, And the fact that we were able to speak the way we spoke, I'm sure that people listening to this conversation will continue taking up where we've left off, and especially what you're doing, because you've probably started it now. And I'm sure that a lot of people listening would want to get involved. There are people who have their own ways of doing this and can join in with you. But once again, Kritika, I think maybe we could speak again in some time when you have or when you're back down here. But on behalf of everyone here at Indian Genes, to all our listeners, it's been an absolutely amazing opportunity to speak to you. So thank you, and hope you can visit us once again at Indian Genes.
I would thank you, and it's been such an honor to speak to you. And like I said before, your podcast, some of the topics go over my head, so I felt very honored that you actually wanted to speak to me. So I really appreciate being here, and I really do hope we can do this again. Yeah,
Definitely we will. Thank you so much.
thank you.